Jesus is coming. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the signs of Jesus coming. Let's talk about what the scriptures say about when Jesus is going to come. I'm assuming to people who are raised in Christian families, people who are going to church, people who believe in Jesus, people who love Jesus. We need to know that we're ready. We need to know what to look for, right? And we hear all these people talking about, like, you guys remember the blood moons, right? You remember everybody talking about the blood moons. There's so many of them showing up, and everybody thought the blood moons was a sign of Jesus coming. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And I'm just going to go into Matthew 24 because it's like one of the most recognizable and easiest to remember passages that most people will turn to find out, like, when Jesus is coming. What's the signs? What are we supposed to be looking for, right? So let's talk about that. So I'm gonna read you some of Matthew 24, and we're going to talk about what Jesus said the signs are, and we're going to go into that just a little bit. So Jesus in Matthew 24, he went out from the temple, right? And his disciples came to him. Jesus says, "Do you see all these things?" He says, "Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." He's talking about the destruction of the temple. So he sits down on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples come to him in private. When is the temple going to be destroyed? Excuse me. "And what is the sign of your coming in the end of the age?" Like when he's going to set up his kingdom. Jesus says, "Take heed, be careful that no man deceives you, because many will come in my name saying, 'I am Christ, I am the Messiah,' and they will deceive many people. And you will hear about wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled when you hear about the wars and rumors of wars, because the end is not yet." Right? "For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Because nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom." That is a Jewish way of referring to world war. Nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And there'll be world wars or worldwide wars. There'll be famines. There'll be pestilences, earthquakes in different places. And all of these, he says, are the beginning of the sorrows or birth pains. All of these are the beginning of the birth pains. So when these things are happening in this last age, he says, this is like the beginning of going into labor to deliver the child. So the child is coming, okay? Now, we're not talking about Jesus coming again as a child. We're talking about the birth pains are like a symptom, right? That tells you that what you're waiting for, that you've been waiting for all this time, is about to happen. So I want to say something first about this last days thing. In Hebrews chapter 1, I think it's the first verse, the apostle says, "In these last days, God has spoken to us by his Son." From the time that Jesus came to the earth, they're living in the last days or the last age of humanity. So they're looking for the end of the world, but they believe that they're in the very ends of the world, of course, already. And Jesus is saying that the beginning of the birth pains that we're to see when the child is coming, when this thing that we're waiting for so long is finally going to happen, the kingdom against kingdom, nation against nation, the world wars, the famines, the pestilences and plagues, and the earthquakes, these are the beginnings of the birth pains to show us that the time is at hand, the time is upon us, right? Now, he doesn't say how long that period lasts. We don't know how long the birth pains last, but we know that these are symptoms that show that the birth is coming, right? So then they'll deliver you up to be afflicted, and they'll kill you. And you'll be hated of all nations or all the peoples of the world for my sake, he says, or for my name's sake. And many will be offended and betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because sin will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But those that endure until the end, or last until the end, stay in the faith, right, will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world for a witness to the nations, and then the end shall come. It says all these signs that everybody thinks that, like, we see these earthquakes and the pestilences, the plagues, the pandemics, right? We see all this stuff happening, the world wars and all this stuff. Like, Jesus is coming, Jesus is coming. Well, that's true. I believe that's true. But Jesus isn't coming because, like, right now or soon or however soon that is, because we see world wars, famines, pestilences, and earthquakes happening in different places. This is a sign of the last times, and these are the birth pains that lead up to Jesus' return. Again, not that he's going to be born on the earth again. That's not how it happens, okay? But this is, he's talking about, like, when you're waiting with expectancy, you're expecting something to happen and you're waiting for it. These are the symptoms that show you that it's on its way. Many false prophets are going to rise up and deceive many people, and this is all supposed to happen. Well, we've seen this stuff happening, right? And I think that some people look and they say, well, look, there's a false Christ, Jesus is coming. Well, no, it's not quite that way. Even when you see these false prophets, many false Christs and false prophets will rise up. And he talks about, then or during these times, God's people would be delivered up to be afflicted, to be killed. They'll be hated of all the nations for his name's sake. We know that's been going on since the time of the apostles, right? The apostles themselves. I mean, I remember that Nero blamed them for the fire, the great fire that took place in Rome, and they were burning and killing Christians. There were worldwide wars going on back in those days too. First, you had the generals. When Nero was gone, you had all these generals fighting each other to try to take over the empire. And then you had on the other side of the empire, you had suddenly there's civil wars breaking out. There's Jews and fighting Jews. There's Jews fighting Gentiles and vice versa. And there's just war everywhere. And then you've got Titus coming to put that down, and he's burning the cities all the way across from Rome all the way to Israel. So there's this massive, can you imagine? I would have thought that it was happening right then too. Jesus must be coming, right? Because nations rising against nation and kingdoms are rising against kingdoms. And there's famines and there's pestilences and there's earthquakes. And they're delivering up God's people to be afflicted and killing them and betraying them. So there's a lot of that stuff going on. There were Christian martyrs. We know that there were persecutions against God's people throughout history. I mean, even by so-called Holy Roman Empire was persecuting true believers in Jesus. So, and burning them at the stake and all this stuff. And people were betraying one another then also. The reformers believed that the Catholic leadership was Antichrist. And they very well could be right. Because, it's not always true, faithful believers that end up in positions of leadership. Unfortunately, sometimes, Paul even spoke of this, that some of the earliest bishops, he said, if you look in Acts, some of the earliest bishops would pervert the teachings and lead disciples away after themselves. And Paul was warning them day and night with tears, weeping, because they were going to pervert the teachings of the gospel. Anyway, so Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says that those that endure to the end will be saved. He says this gospel of the kingdom is going to be preached in the whole world as a witness to the nations. You therefore see the abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke of. We'll get into that in a second. Standing in the holy place, let those that are in Judea flee to the mountains. So something happening in Israel, in the holy place. And when you see that, let those that are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those that are in the housetop not come down and take anything out of the house. Don't let those that are in the field turn back to take their clothes. And woe to them that are with child or that are nursing in those days. But pray that your flight doesn't happen in the winter or on the Sabbath. Because then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days be shortened, though no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, for the chosen of God's sake, those days will be shortened. And he says, then if any man says to you, look, Christ is here or there, he says, don't believe it. They say he's in the secret room, don't believe it. Because false Christs and false prophets will rise up, and they'll show great signs and wonders, and says, insomuch that if it were possible to deceive even the elect. And he says, behold, I've told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he's in the desert, don't go there. He says, if they say he's in the secret chamber, don't believe it. He says, because as the lightning comes and as it shines from the east to the west when it flashes, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Suddenly, after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see him coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet, and gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the earth to the other. People say there's a missing 70th week in Daniel. And that 70th week, they believe, is when Jesus comes back. And so they point to this and they say this is the Antichrist in the 70th week. And, I honestly, I'm not quite sure how they reached this conclusion, but there were books written where so-called prophecy experts claimed that there's a missing 70th week, and that's going to be 7 years of tribulation, and the tribulation is going to be affliction upon God's people. This is absolutely a false idea, though, and I'm gonna show you that. So we're going to go into Daniel 9, and in Daniel chapter 9. Daniel is praying. He's praying that God will forgive him. He's confessing his sins. He's confessing the sins of his people. He's praying for the holy city, praying that God will restore them and forgive them. And he's just talking about how they turned against God and they did wickedly. And he's begging God to let his anger and his anger and his wrath be turned away from Jerusalem. And so he's praying, and while he's praying, Gabriel, the archangel, shows up. And Gabriel says to him that there are 70 weeks of years, basically, 70 weeks of years that are determined upon the Jewish people and upon the holy city, okay? And these weeks, these 70 weeks, that are determined upon the people of Jerusalem and people of Israel and upon their holy city, Jerusalem, to finish the transgression. That's this period of time is for. To finish that transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for sin, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. He says, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem, and you have to understand this from Daniel's perspective. Daniel is in Babylonian captivity. Their temple's been destroyed. This is before Jesus. So he's telling Daniel that the temple is going to be rebuilt, and it's going to be rebuilt in a time of trouble. But he says from the time that the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem goes out until Messiah the Prince shows up is going to be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So a total of 69 weeks until Messiah comes. Okay? So he's telling Daniel when Messiah is going to show up, right? From the time that the commandment goes forth to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which is 69. After that period of time, Messiah is going to be cut off or killed, but not for himself. People of the ruler that will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So here Daniel's being told the city is going to be rebuilt, the temple's going to be rebuilt, and then it's going to be destroyed again after Messiah comes. There's a lot of stuff that led up to that, and you really should, if you're interested in how this all happened, read the writings of Josephus about angelic armies fighting in the sky and the signs that happened around the temple. Anyway, so he says, he will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he will cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations, that's what Jesus was talking about, right? For the overspreading or overflow of abominations means idolatrous, filthy, unclean. So he says for the overflow of abominations or unclean or filthy things or people, he will make it desolate or ruined, even until the final end. It will be ruined until the final end. And that which is determined will be poured upon the desolate. So this whole thing, if you look at it closely, you'll see that the week where it says that in the midst, after the Messiah was cut off, the people of the prince that come destroy the city and the sanctuary. He shall confirm the covenant for 1 week. That's your 70th week. And then it ends with the destruction of the temple. Now, I don't know if the confirming of the covenant was when Jesus was preaching before he was cut off. But we know that the 69 weeks had already passed before he came. He's cut off. He causes the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. The sacrifice and the drink offering is stopped in the midst of the week. The city and the sanctuary are destroyed. So if you go back into like the other gospels, like we're in Matthew 24, but if you go, I believe, I don't know if it's Mark or if it's probably Mark. Actually, let me look in Mark. In one of them, it talks about how talks about that when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, run to the mountains. And then in Matthew's, it says, when you see the abomination of desolation, it means the unclean or the idolatrous or the filthy, well, unclean and filthy are the same thing. The unclean or the idolatrous thing or people, right? The abomination of desolation, the abomination or the overflow of abomination that causes the destruction of the temple. See, again, in Daniel, I want to look back at that again really quick. So that was Daniel 9. So he says, for the overspreading of abominations is why the temple was destroyed. Now, Gentiles were not allowed to come into the temple, and certainly not in the holy place. And they did, actually, when they were going after Jerusalem to destroy it, they did enter the holy place. But the overflow or overspreading of abominations is the reason given in Daniel 9 why God makes the temple desolate or ruined, why he allows it to be destroyed, right? So that's what he's talking about in Matthew 24, when he says the abomination of desolation is the abomination that causes the desolation of the temple and the sanctuary. So Jesus says, when therefore you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, so it's specifically referring to the destruction of the temple. We know this, right? When you see that abomination standing in the holy place, then those that are in Judea run to the mountains, and let those that are on the housetop not come back down to get his clothes or whatever, or get anything. Those that are in the field, don't get your clothes. Those that are in the house, don't come back down into your house to get stuff. And there's good reason for that. And that's because if they did, they could have gotten stuck in the city. And you would not want to be in Jerusalem when this stuff was happening. So basically what happened was there were some really bad incidents that happened with the people ruling in Jerusalem. And there were Jewish people who were murdered, massacred. There was also, by some of these rulers or their people, and there was also an incident where some Gentiles had put a bird, an unclean animal, a dead bird, on the stoop of a synagogue. And so with all of this stuff going on, it caused this enormous revolt, and it caused civil war all throughout Israel and Syria. You had Israelites fighting Israelites. You had, Gentiles and Jews fighting one another. It was crazy. And so there was just this massive fighting all throughout Israel. This whole thing is, again, you see the apostles talking to Jesus about the stones and how amazing it is. These great buildings, and he starts talking to them about the destruction that's coming. Remember that. This is not just him talking about the end of the world. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. That's how he started off this conversation, was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And then he says, that false Christs are going to come. There's going to be wars and rumors of wars, but the end is not yet. There's going to be world wars, nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom, is world wars in Jewish the way they phrase things. And there will be earthquakes and famines and troubles, and these are the beginnings of the birth pains. You'll be brought before rulers and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them, and the gospel must first be published among all nations. Now this says among all nations, and the other passage, the way he phrased it, was in all the world as a witness for all nations. But when they will lead you and deliver you up to their death or whatever, take no thought, or to the synagogues to be grilled by the religious leaders or kings or whatever. He says, don't think ahead of time what you'll speak. Don't premeditate it, but whatever you say will be given to you in that hour. It's not you that's speaking, he says, but the Holy Spirit. So brother will betray brother to death, and the father the son, and children will rise up against their parents and cause them to be put to death. And you'll be hated of all for my sake, my name's sake, but he that endures to the end, the same will be saved. Right? But when you see, okay, so he says abomination of desolation too. All these things that you behold, the days will come in which there shall be not left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. They're saying, Master, when shall these things be? And what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? The destruction of Jerusalem. And see, in this one, they don't even say end of the age. This one says, when will these things be? The destruction of Jerusalem is what he's talking about. And what will be the sign when these things shall come to pass? The destruction of Jerusalem. And that's when he says, take heed that you're not deceived, because many will come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and the time draws near. Do not go after them. But when you shall hear of wars and commotions, do not be terrified, for these must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, so world wars. Great earthquakes will be in different places, and famines and pestilences, and fearful sights, and great signs shall there be from heaven. Now, if you read Josephus, you realize that is exactly what happened before Jerusalem was destroyed. There were great signs and fearful signs from heaven. Great signs, fearful sights, and great signs from heaven. Armies fighting in the city, in the skies above Jerusalem, I would call that a great and fearful sign from heaven. But before these things, he says, before the destruction of Jerusalem, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and into the prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, and will turn to you for a testimony. Settle it therefore in your hearts not to think ahead what you will answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries shall not be able to speak against or resist, and you shall be betrayed both by parents and brothers and kinsfolk and friends. And some of you they will cause to be put to death. And you'll be hated of all for my name's sake. But there shall not a hair of your head perish. In your patience possess you your souls. And when you shall see Jerusalem surrounded with armies, then know that the desolation of it is near. These are the signs he said would happen before the destruction of Jerusalem. Then let those that are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those that are in the midst of it depart out, and let them not that are in the countries enter in. Don't enter into Jerusalem from out in the surrounding areas, and don't stay in Jerusalem when you see those armies surrounding it. Those armies started surrounding it because they were trying to put down the revolts that were happening as a result of civil war that broke out because of the things that happened. Again, you can read about that in Josephus' histories. For these are the days of vengeance. Is talking about the wrath of God. Another word for that is indignation. The indignation is God's wrath upon the Jewish people. He says, don't enter back into Jerusalem when you see these armies surrounding it, because these are the days of vengeance, that all things that are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those that are with child and to those that are nursing in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people, Jerusalem, Israel. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trampled down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. All of this, if you go to Luke chapter 21, from the very beginning of that, right? He's only talking about here the destruction of Jerusalem in that whole passage. So that gives us some more insight into when the order of these events, right? Because he talks about them being persecuted for their faith, betrayed by their families and their friends, right? And being put to death and everything. And he talks about, nations rising against nations and kingdoms against kingdoms, and great earthquakes and famines and pestilences and fearful sights and great signs in the heavens. Wow. And this is the sign of the destruction of Jerusalem. This is not necessarily a sign of the Lord's coming. Okay? And the false Christ, he talks about them too. And how they're going to be dragged before kings and synagogues and everything else and put in prison and, beaten and killed and whatnot and hated by everyone, right? And when you see Jerusalem surrounded with armies, know that its desolation is near. Its desolation. Then let them that are Judea flee to the mountains, right? Don't go back into the cities, because these are the days of vengeance, or the indignation, so that all the things that are written may be fulfilled, right? And he goes on again, about, praying that those, but woe to those that are with child and those that are nursing in those days, because great distress upon the land. And in another passage in Matthew's gospel, he says, because there will be great tribulation, such as never has been and never will be again in these times, in the times of the destruction of Israel and Jerusalem and of their temple. And there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people, the people of Israel. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. Again, this is in Luke 21. And Jerusalem will be trampled down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And there shall be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and on the earth distress of nations with perplexity. That means confusion with no way out. The sea and the waves roaring. Men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things that are coming upon the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the cloud with power and great glory. Then, right? So he talks about great signs and fearful signs in the heavens in the other gospel too, of like the sun, the moon, the stars, right? But that's when Jesus is coming. He talks about earthquakes, famines, and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. He's not talking about the time when Jesus comes, because they're talking about first, you're going to have all this persecution and tribulation, and the city's going to be destroyed, the temple's going to be destroyed, there's going to be, war everywhere, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilence, fearful signs, and great signs, fearful sights and great signs from heaven. Right? And he says in the other passages, there will never be a time of tribulation this bad again. This is how bad it was. And if you read Josephus, you'll realize it was horrific. So they'll fall by the edge of the sword, and they'll be taken captive into the other nations. They're taken out to the nations, and now we've seen them being brought back to Israel. But Israel will be trampled of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. So this was all prior to that. Then there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and on the earth distress of nations with perplexity, confusion with no way out, the sea and the waves roaring. Men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things that are coming upon the earth, because the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they shall see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And when these things begin to come to pass, look up and lift up your head, because your redemption comes nigh. What things? The men's hearts failing them for fear, the sun, the moon, and the stars, the powers of heavens being shaken, right? The feeling of perplexity and confusion and no way out for the people of the earth, the sea and the waves roaring. Men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking at the things that are coming upon the earth. He's talking about these signs in the sun and moon and the stars. And that's when they see the Son of Man coming in cloud with power and great glory. That's why he says, when you see these things, look up, lift up your head, your redemption's drawing near. Not talking about the famines and the earthquakes and the pestilences and the plagues. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, when you see these signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and on the earth distress of nations, the nations will be in great distress and confusion and fear, feeling like they have no way out. The sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them, looking at what's coming upon the earth, right? And that's when they see the Son of Man. It says, because the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Because that's why they're fearful. That's why they're freaking out. That's why they're distressed and confused, and they feel like they have no way, because they see this happening, the powers of the heavens being shaken, the sun and moon going dark, the stars falling down, right? And then they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and glory. When this happens, look up and lift up your head. Your redemption draws near, right? That's amazing. That gives us so much clarity, doesn't it, to what we're reading in Matthew 24. Because in Matthew 24, we know that he says that when we see those signs in the sun and moon and the stars, when that happens, that's when they see Jesus and he gathers his elect. Suddenly, after the tribulation, that he was already talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, the persecution of all the saints, they're being betrayed by their family members and everything, their cities destroyed. He says immediately. That word means suddenly. It's not immediately. It means suddenly. Suddenly, after the tribulation of those days, right? The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, the powers of the heaven will be shaken. Just what he was saying in Luke 21. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. All the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he'll send his angels with the sound of a trumpet, gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the earth to the other. That is incredible. Now when he says, now learn a parable of the fig tree, when his branch is tender and he puts forth his leaves, you know that summer is nigh. So likewise, when you see these things, know that it is even at the doors. What is he talking about, these things? The sun, the moon, the stars, the powers of the heavens being shaken. That's when we will know that Jesus is and then we'll see him, right? Truly I say to you, this generation shall not pass till these things will be fulfilled. What generation? The one that sees the powers of the heaven being shaken. We have this habit, unfortunately, of reading these things and making assumptions. We make a lot of assumptions. People have thought for generations probably that Daniel was talking about the Antichrist. He's not. There's no missing week. Daniel was referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, in the prophecies of Daniel, in some of the prophecies, you can look at it and it kind of seems like it might be talking about when the Lord comes back. But the thing about these prophecies is sometimes there's what we call a parentheses, where it's basically will jump from one thing to another, even from one time period to another. He has just in chapter 11, I believe it is, yeah, it's the kings of the north and the south and whatnot. That is actually a description, I believe, of, you know, in other parts of Daniel, Gabriel has given him images of these different empires that would rise up, and he describes them in different ways. One of them is, what is it, a bird with 4 heads or something? He talks about how the king of Greece, his kingdom is split up into 4, north, south, east, and west. And basically, this is describing Alexander the Great and his kingdom being of Greece being split up between his generals. And then it talks about these battles, and all of this is what leads up to the Roman Empire, right? This is what leads up to that last empire that we see in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where you have the statue that really represents from Babylon down to the Roman Empire. And we see that the Roman Empire is going to be split into 2, and then it's going to be split into 10, because 10 rulers, we learn in Revelation of John, will give their authority to the beast, right? The beast is the empire or a kingdom. The word beast just means creature. And these empires are described as creatures, and the Bible interprets the Bible. So when we see these creatures, even in Revelation, it's basically these empires that are rising up, okay? So in Daniel 12, he says, at the time that Michael stands up, the great prince that stands for the children of your people, speaking of Israel, there will be a time of trouble such as never was. Now, they just got through describing all these other empires, the generals that divided Greece, right? And the fights between them. And then it talks about this last empire, which is Roman Empire, okay? And how they will the last one will plant his tabernacles or his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain, but he will come to his end and no one will help him. It's not talking about Antichrist, okay? It's talking about like in the Roman Empire. Now, in that period of time, the Roman Empire, Michael will stand up, the great prince who stands for the children of your people, and there will be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone that is found written in the book. In other words, the believers, right, who are found in the book of life will be delivered in that time of trouble. Jesus warned them ahead of time and said, when you see the army surrounding Jerusalem, run. Don't go back in your house. Don't go back to get your clothes from the field. Run to the mountains. But he's talking about, he says, everyone is found written in the book, it's referring to the book of life, will be delivered at that time. Many of those that sleep in the earth shall awake. That happened. Remember, there was a resurrection of righteous people around the time of Jesus' resurrection. Remember that? They all went into the cities. Many of them that sleep in the dust shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. It doesn't tell us, you know, we don't know what happened after those people initially were resurrected. Now, it is possible that this could be a parenthesis where it jumps to the future from the time of, the time of trouble, right? That Jesus referred to. And this all clearly refers, Daniel referred to it as the destruction of Jerusalem, right? We know because it was the abomination of desolation. This is referring to that same period of time. We know that because Jesus said so. He said this was the time of trouble. And he said it was the same as the abomination of desolation that leads to the destruction of Jerusalem. So this is all about that time period. There could be a jump from the time when he talks about that time of trouble to where he says everyone that at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found in the book of life. Now, sometimes they condense time in prophecy, so that's possible as well. When he talks about this resurrection, it might not be the people that were resurrected around the time Jesus was, but the fact that they were makes you wonder, was this that? right? So it's not as clear as we would like it to be. But he says that those that are, raised to, those that are wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness will shine as the stars forever and ever. And he tells Daniel to shut up the book, and he says, many will run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. It's talking about the increase of knowledge. It's not talking about air transportation. And I can't remember, or car transportation. I can't remember exactly how that was explained to me by Jewish believers, but that's talking about the increase of knowledge. So then, Daniel gets a little bit more information from the angel, and he's talking about how the enemy is going to scatter the power, or God will scatter the power of the holy people. And all these things will be finished. But there's like this condensation or condensing rather of time. And it's hard for us to know, because sometimes it'll jump from one thing to the end, right? And he's talking about this time of trouble. And we know that suddenly after that time of trouble is when, Jesus was going to come back. The sun go dark, sun and moon and the stars falling, and, the powers of heaven being shaken, and then Jesus returning. We just don't have, they're not telling us right here in Daniel 12 what happens in between Michael standing up for his people during this time of trouble, and then, the very final part where there's resurrection or whatever. And we know that doesn't all happen at the same time. Even if you want to compare Daniel 12 to the Revelation of John, you can't see where that time period is, like how that gets broken down. It's just not visible, because they have condensed it down clearly when they jump from that time of trouble to, the resurrection. There's just no way to see what's going on here exactly, but it's the clues that were given in the Gospels, in Matthew and Luke and Mark's depiction, describing what Jesus said. We know that time of trouble was when the time of the destruction of the temple. But I hope you can see that, even the 70th week, there is no missing 70th week. There can't be the whole idea that there's 7 years of this tribulation is based on the false idea that there's a missing 70th week. There isn't one. So we can't even rely on this 7-year tribulation stuff that people try to glean from these prophecies. It's just not there. Daniel's prophecy ends with the destruction of the temple, and then the resurrection, whether that's the resurrection of the people in Jesus' day or whether that's the resurrection later on. We just don't know that. But again, the time of trouble is the one Jesus was talking about, the destruction of the temple. So really, the only signs that we're waiting for Jesus' return, they're not going to be signs that happen where we still have time. That's why Jesus said he comes at a time when we don't expect him. He says, just like the days of Noah and Lot, life is going to be pretty normal. People are going to be buying and selling. They're going to get married and give their children in marriage, right? They're just going to be going about their daily lives, just like in the days of Noah. And just like in the days of Lot was going about his business when the angels came and dragged him and his family out of there, right? And then fire and brimstone came down and destroyed the city. It's something that there could be no preparation for, right? Because God is going to take his people out, but it happens right around the same time as the sun and the moon going dark, the stars falling from the heavens, and the powers of the heavens being shaken. So we're not going to have some big, massive sign where, these blood moons or whatever. Oh, Jesus is coming because there's a blood moon. No, Jesus could come at any moment. We've seen all the signs. We won't know when the last group has heard the gospel. We won't know, right? Jesus said, not only that, you won't know the day or the hour. Now, we can know the season, and we see all this stuff happening around us. Believe me, we see the signs of all these elites. They're not even hiding anymore, that they're trying to create a global governance, right? They're not even hiding. We see rulers giving their authority to the empire, the beast or the creature, which is an empire, right? That's basically the Roman Empire split up with 10 rulers, right? We kind of see that. The Roman Empire split into 2 in Nebuchadnezzar's dream on that statue. That 2 that was split up, that's East and West Roman Empire, right? And then we see it further divided into 10 toes. Now we know that its power was taken away for a period of time, but then there are rulers that give their authority to this beast empire. And that beast empire that Jesus destroys when he comes back is the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire is made up of basically nations that it consumed and devoured, right? They became a part of it when it devoured them, right? And so we understand that some of those same nations could be part of it now, where they give their authority to this governing body. It may not look like it's one world government, or it might. Maybe they'll make that more obvious at some point. But right now, we see Trudeau, and we even see the Biden administration that are following the lead, and the people in our own Congress that are on the left, we see them following the dictates, basically, of the UN when they tell people we need to eat less meat so we can save the planet, right? And what happens? All of a sudden, our Congress is trying to pass a law, put a fee on beef and dairy farmers, an over $4,000 per cow fee they tried to put on them that would have devastated the beef and dairy industries, and we would all be malnourished. Thank God there were conservatives in that saw what was happening and stopped it, right? Thank God we had enough conservatives in there to stop that, because we'd be in big trouble right now. But that's part of their goals, right? Is because it's that hyper-environmentalist, new ager, occultist, that's all this stuff, right? It's not just socialism and communism and trying to make the UN into a federal government and all the nations into states. It's basically a copy of the Roman Empire, which is really interesting, because if you look at the stuff, we make assumptions when we read that, that the false prophet is going to, by his miraculous stuff, he's going to deceive people into creating a copy or a likeness of the beast. Well, the beast is being described, it's an empire, right? Its 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman, Rome, sits. Rome is defined, we know that that's Rome because it's the city that was ruling at the time of John when he wrote this, right? So we know that that's Rome. And the Rome, the woman, is sitting on this beast empire. So the beast empire is not Rome alone, but it's sitting on it, right? And this empire has 10 rulers that give their authority to it. Right now, we see these people following the lead of the UN. And I want to point to the fact that the Clintons also, I believe, were involved in this, because not only did Bill Clinton talk about global governance, because he doesn't want to scare you with the word government. And then Hillary Clinton, who claims that it's just a brainstorming session as she visualizes Eleanor Roosevelt speaking to her, to give her information. That's what New Agers say too. It's your inner self, right, guiding you or whatever, but that's not what it is. Al Gore, Clinton's running mate, was a New Ager. He still tried to put out, remember he tried to put out that big movie about global warming that was such a flop. The thing is that these beliefs in climate change and everything came out of New Age teachings from deceiving spirits, okay? Your spirit guides, you're giving them misinformation, claiming that the world is in this dire crisis and the world needs to be as one or else it's going to be destroyed. That's doctrines of demons, okay, that they're following. And that's where it came from before they started trying to convince everybody else. Now you've got media and politicians and the entertainment industry, all of them are on board with this garbage, right? The people that are in charge, at least, of these things are on board with this garbage. It doesn't take a ton of people to convince massive numbers of the population of planet Earth if you've got people in key places that are pushing the same narrative, right? So anyways, what is my point? My point is that these people, Bill Clinton, during his administration, they tried to get, I don't know who's supposed to sign, I guess the Senate, tried to get them to sign a, quote, treaty from the UN that was supposed to, quote, benefit children, right? I forget the name of it. International something something for children, right? So they tried to get them to sign it. Thank God somebody read it, because most of these people were not doing their homework and reading the stuff before they signed it. Somebody read it and they found this information in it where they were trying to get whoever signs this treaty, the nations that sign it, to make it so that parents did not have any right anymore to monitor and have any say in what their children would watch and listen to. Think about that, and then think about the stuff that they're indoctrinating them within the schools. right? And in the media and in the entertainment industry. These guys are all together in this stuff. If you look at the cartoons and stuff that the media industry puts out, you see things like spirits or aliens coming through portals into children's rooms and then, oh, come with me, help us save our whatever, right? I mean, it's crazy teaching these kids that beings can come through portals to lead them somewhere, to show them things or whatever, right? And when you start understanding how demons operate and how they can cause very real seeming illusions, visions that feel real, even where you can feel objects that aren't really there, and you can see things as basically a created environment. I'm going to get into that in one of the videos. I'm going to talk to you about an instance that happened to me, and we're going to talk about like, alien abductions and, out-of-body experiences and spirit travel. I'm going to talk to you about that, about what happened to me, and try to help, and what happened to Stephen Bancars, and try to help you understand this is a power that these beings have as former loyal angels of God who rebelled, but they seem to have maintained their powers to create these visions and experiences. It's a spiritual communication tool or ability that God gave them to be messengers of God. But they have corrupted it because they rebelled against God. They became corrupt, and now they use it to deceive people. So it's really, really interesting when you start to learn this stuff. But so we've got these people throughout the world, right? We've got these people trying to create a one world governance, which, it may look like these states, and actually the way they're trying to set it up, the states will seem to have some sovereignty, right? Some sovereignties, like Angela Merkel saying we need to give up some of our sovereignty. No one can do it alone. We all need to band together. No one can do it alone, right? They're trying to get nations to give up some of their sovereignty. Well, to give up some is to give up all. Because if you've got somebody else that's calling you shots above you, guess what? You're no longer sovereign. So they're trying to create a one world governance that appears very much like what the word says. There are rulers who will give their authority to the beast empire or kingdom. So they're trying to create what to me appears like a copy of the Roman Empire, but really is just an extension of the Roman Empire, like in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Anyways, I hope this stuff has helped open some eyes. And, I'm not claiming that I have all the information or all the expertise or knowledge, but I believe that God has spoken to me about these things and taught me these things through the word as I have studied and prayed over it. And I hope that you can see that from what I've shared with you. So anyways, Jesus is coming. We don't know when he's coming. Is he coming tonight? Is he coming in a week? Is he coming in a year? 10 years, we don't know. And Jesus says to be ready at all times. Have your loins girded about, right? And your lamps burning, which is kind of a reference to the Jewish wedding, right? Like the groom would go and prepare a place at his father's house, prepare a place for him and his bride to dwell, right? And he's going to come back for his bride, and nobody knows when he's coming. And the bride is supposed to be ready, and the groomsmen come with him. The bride and the bridesmaid are supposed to be ready at any time. So when the shout goes up and he says, the bridegroom comes, they're supposed to go out with their lamps and go meet him, right? And then they have a procession that goes back to the Father's house where he's prepared a dwelling for them. And that's exactly what's going on with Jesus. He's prepared a dwelling for us, and he's going to come back and get us, his bride. And we need to be ready at any time. Jesus said, watch and pray, and he told us that he's coming like a thief, and we won't know. Well, he'll come at a time we don't expect him. So wow, what exciting times we live in. Yes, we're surrounded with chaos. We're surrounded with a bunch of really unfortunately deceived people that the enemy has pulled the wool over their eyes. Some of them might be in league with him intentionally, but in any case, they're deceived. And we need to pray for these people, pray for the people in our communities, in our cities, our states, our nation, right? And around the world, and pray for the people in authority, for our children, right? There's so many things we need to talk about, but I wanted to talk first about Jesus coming and, help to open that conversation about, what we can expect. And really, the truth is we can expect him at any time.